One person can be in charge as long as everyone else agrees. The idea that authority derives from the consent of the governed is not a new idea. It's in the Declaration of Independence. It's probably been around as long as there's been humans. It's basic political philosophy. That has a lot of application to everything that's going on right now, but what I want to talk about is how it applies to DIY and to mental health. So just a little background so we're all on the same page here. Basically what it means is, it also goes along with the idea of social contracts. Trevor Noah did a really deep talk about social contracts not too long ago, and how if a group isn't part of that contract, then expecting them to abide by it doesn't make sense. And that kind of goes along with the same thing. If you haven't consented to the authority of a group, then as humans, we don't feel like they have authority over us. So consent is a thing we talk about a lot too. And there's basically two types of consent. There's implied consent and expressed consent. Just like they sound, implied consent means you're going along with whatever it is, and it's assumed that you consent. And the other kind, expressed consent, means you're saying, yes, I'm with this, I'm in on it. And there's two basic ways of getting consent. There is requested consent, and then there's threatened consent. Basically, consent is given because the person giving it is afraid of violence. That's what it comes down to. Or the person is consenting because they approve of the situation. Basically, make them afraid to not give consent, or involve them in the situation and create something that they can consent to. So while this is usually discussed in like macro terms, governments and states and large groups, I realized when I was thinking about it, it applies on the micro level too. It applies to small groups just as much, and maybe even more easily seen. In a band, there's usually at least one person, maybe more than one, who's driving the thing, even if they're not in complete control. People look to them as a leader. And we also know what happens if you've ever been in a band. You know what happens when power goes to that person's head and maybe they start being a dick and people withdraw their consent. Sometimes they even kick the person out of the band. And if you've ever worked in a place where you were a supervisor or you had a supervisor, you know how that works as well. So as a supervisor, there's really only two ways to get people to do what you ask them to do. You can threaten them with punishment, or you can lead by example and set expectations. Both technically work, but we all know the former is going to lead to more problems than it actually solves. So, what does that all have to do with DIY or mental health? Well, I got to thinking about it. The DIY ethos that I like to talk about in this channel comes out of the whole punk scene. Now, I've never been a part of the scene, I don't want to pretend like I have been, but the concept that's intrinsic to it is deep and can be applied to just about everything. The idea is not just rejecting authority, but purposefully doing the things that they say you can't do. It's rebelling against the idea that there are gatekeepers who determine right ways to do things, who determine who succeeds and who doesn't, and what you have to look like and how you have to behave to get there. Punk came along and said, yeah, no. It's basically the idea of counterculture. It's not rejecting the end goals necessarily, it's rejecting that someone else can decide how you reach those goals and who's going to get there. Now, in arts and entertainment, man, right now is a golden age for that. There's never been a better time to be DIY. You have multiple distribution platforms that are basically free to access with built-in audiences. Got tools to create with that are free or incredibly inexpensive. And we have a current environment where, as long as you meet a minimum level of quality to where it's just not distracting, content is king. The only real gatekeepers are the audience. And as creators, what we're doing is asking the audience for their consent. So that's a little simplistic, but basically that's how it works. So the idea that authority derives from the consent of the governed, in this case, the governed is your audience, and they have the authority. And you're asking for some of what they have, which is their time and their attention. You're asking for their consent. And ideally, if you prove to be a good steward of that consent, they will follow you. And if you prove to be a bad steward of that consent, even if it was previously given, it will be withdrawn, and you will find yourself without a following. So when I was thinking about all of that, I realized that I have internal gatekeepers. I have these voices inside that I didn't put there that tell me I can't do things, that I'm no good at things, that I'm going to fail, that I may as well not even start. They tell me I have to do certain things. I have to do them the right way. If I don't do them the right way, then I will be rejected. I will be cut off. I will lose. I have these thoughts and attitudes, and I suspect from talking to other people that everybody with an anxiety disorder, at a minimum, has these thoughts and attitudes in their head, these internal gatekeepers. And just like with the other situations, it's a question of fear or threat versus agency and involvement. Being locked into or trapped into a certain path versus choosing my own path. And here's what I realized. I didn't consent to be governed by any of that. I didn't choose to have an anxiety disorder. I was probably born with it. I didn't choose to be depressive. I didn't choose to be an introvert. I was either born this way, or it's a response to early childhood situations, or some combination. Doesn't matter. The point is, I didn't consent to this. And if I didn't consent, then it doesn't have authority over me. I'm not bound by that contract because I didn't sign it. Now, just like everything in the world around us, situations are what they are. Reality is what it is. So I'm not saying I'm going to pretend like these things aren't true. They are true, and they have to be dealt with. But what I am saying is that they have no authority. They can't tell me what to do. I may have to acknowledge certain realities, but that doesn't mean anything but what I decide it means. That doesn't mean I have to follow a certain path because I have an anxiety disorder, because I have depression, because I'm an introvert. Yes, as an introvert, it costs me energy to interact with other people. I do need time to recover. And for me, the group of people that it doesn't cost me energy to interact with is very, very tiny. It's different with different people. But beyond those basic physical facts, me being an introvert doesn't mean anything else. Most importantly, it doesn't mean that I can't do things. It means that I can do whatever I want if I can find a way to do it. And the way that I need to do it may look completely different from the way other people do it. It's going to look completely different from how extroverts do it. It's going to look completely different from the way people without anxiety disorders do it. And you know, there are so many of us with mental health issues of one kind or another. The way that works for me with my anxiety disorder and depression and introversion is going to be completely different than how it works for somebody with a different set of issues. The point is that these issues do not have authority over us. We get to decide what we're going to do. And just like we live in a society, so we can't pretend that what other people do doesn't impact us and what we do doesn't impact other people. That's just basic level reality. We can't ignore what our mental health issues are, but we get to decide what they mean for us and how we're going to deal with them. My disease has no authority over me. I refuse consent. I hope this has been helpful, or at least interesting. Maybe gave you something to think about. If you made it this far, please consider giving me a little like. And if you want to see more, just hit subscribe down there. If you really liked it, maybe share it with a friend or two. If you really hated it, send it to your enemy. I'm good either way. I hope you're staying well. Stay safe. Wear your masks. Take care, and I will see you next week.